if I could tell you 3 stories in a relatively short period today, and I'm going to try to address the issue of foundational structure and purpose and moral relativism. That'd be a good thing to cover in 35 minutes if we can manage it. But that's part of the utility of stories. They can pack a wallop in a very short period of time in a very memorable way. And so I'm going to start with the story of Jacob and his brother Esau. And that's a story of what happens if you found your life on the desire for power and then decide to change. So it's a story of error and a story of transformation. And it starts with the birth of 2 brothers. They're twins like Cain and Abel, and they emerge, they fight in the womb. And that is a representation, a reflection of the fact that people do strive for dominance, however appropriately or inappropriately, and that often manifests itself in families, between siblings, as well as between, say, metaphorical brothers or enemies. Jacob literally comes out of the womb fighting with Esau, and he's not a good guy. He's seriously not a good guy, and that's actually quite typical of particularly Old Testament biblical narratives. The heroes of those stories, not always, but are often flawed. And Jacob definitely qualifies as someone who's flawed. His first flaw is that he strives after power. Now, it's a modern doctrine that's put forward by political radicals and postmodern types that there is actually no other fundamental orienting motivation than that of power. And my sense of that is that it's an interesting claim, and it is definitely the case that institutions and individuals degenerate in the direction of power, but that doesn't mean that power is the only valid, motivating, and unifying force. And so that begs the question, of course, if it's not power, what else might it be if there is something that unifies it? The story of Jacob actually addresses that. So now Jacob is wrestling with his brother for dominance in the family, and he starts at a disadvantage. His brother has undeserved privilege, you might say, as the firstborn, and in consequence he's granted the lion's share of the inheritance, which was a standard practice at that time among agriculturalists and herder, pastoral people. You couldn't divide your property evenly up among your children because it would take only a few generations, and the parcels of land or parcels of animals, let's say, share of animals would become so small you couldn't sustain yourself or a family, and so that was counterproductive. So in a rather somewhat arbitrary fashion, the decision was made, an impersonal decision, that the firstborn would get the lion's share of the inheritance, and that was just how it was. But Jacob's not happy with this, neither was his mother. And so he conspires with his mother, and the family is divided. And so that's a pretty standard story too. No doubt that may have happened in your own family, that at least at times that fractionate into different groups and work against one another. And that's what happens with Jacob and Esau. So Jacob is a mother's boy. He's a tent dweller. I suppose he's more educated than his more masculine, outdoors-oriented, somewhat impulsive sibling, Esau, who's a man who spends all his time outside hunting and has maybe also the flaws of someone who's oriented in that direction. So, for example, he's more impulsive and more heedless than the conniving Jacob and his conspiring mother. And there's 2 stories of extreme betrayal in that text. So Esau goes out to hunt, and he's a great hunter, especially of deer, and that's partly why his father loves him preferentially, which is part of the family divide. And he comes back from a hunting episode, and he's exhausted and famished, and his brother is busily working away in the kitchen making a porridge out of beans, and Esau asks to be fed, and Jacob, who's always ready with a conspiracy and well-primed with his mother, in consequence of his interactions with his mother, tells him that he'll feed him, but only if he gives him his rights to the firstborn share of the inheritance. And Esau, who plays a causal role in his own downfall, you might say, like we all do, agrees impulsively, and he gets his meal and he gives up his inheritance, and it's a crooked deal. And I suppose Jacob's pretty damn thrilled about how effective his conniving was, despite the fact that he betrayed a man who was his own brother and set his father against him. And I suppose that's the justification that people who use crooked and Machiavellian means to gain power satisfy themselves with, well, paying not enough attention to the broader context, which is, well, you gained something, sure, but in a crooked way, and you warped your own soul in consequence of doing that, and you put a rift in your family, and if you think that was a good deal, then you're more than a bit of a fool. In any case, that's what happens, and Isaac, who's the father, who does not enough to stop this sibling rivalry from emerging, because in principle he could have, if he would have been paying a bit more attention. He's not happy, and he decides he's going to redress the situation with the blessing that will be bestowed on his children, as was the custom before he dies. And he's an old man at this time, and he's going blind, and he doesn't have much more to offer. And Esau, in principle, is out in the wilderness again, hunting, and he comes home, and Isaac prepares to bestow his blessing on him, and he's going to make it, what would you say, he's going to go above and beyond the call of duty so that he can redress the injustice that's been done to his older son with his blessing. But Jacob, being the man that he is, and obsessed with power and conspiring with his mother, dresses up as Esau and fools his father, who is too blind to tell the difference. And he gets the blessing too. And that's not something that in those days you could take back. Your word was your bond, and once you delivered your decision, it was final. And so Jacob walks away with victory, right? He's obtained his position of power. And the fact that he had to do that at the cost of betraying his own brother and his father, well, the chickens come home to roost at that point, because Esau, who's a rather aggressive person, as you might expect from a hunter, more or less decides that he's going to kill his brother, and he has reason. And so Jacob leaves. And that's not the best way to leave home, you might say. But it does give Jacob pause. And this is a crucial issue. You know, one of the things that our students are miseducated about on a regular basis is that all conceptions of up and down, morally speaking, are relative, and that there's no real point of orientation in the world. And you know, that means, I suppose, that you don't have to upbraid yourself with guilt when you make a mistake, because there's no such thing as a mistake, but it leaves you bereft of any understanding if you do act in a reprehensible manner and your life collapses into absolute catastrophe and your brother hates you and you have to run away. It's like, it's possible that that's not good. And it's possible that maybe you had something to do with it, especially if you're a power man and you're conspiring and lying and deceiving and in bed with your mother, so to speak. And that's all Jacob. And so that's down. You might say that's a definition of down. And I suppose Jacob understands that, because now his brother hates him and he has to leave home under a cloud. And he's not very happy about that. And he decides he's going to change. And so that's an interesting twist in the narrative too, because to change implies the direction, that there's a direction to change, right? That if you've made a lot of mistakes and you've ended up in your own particular variety of hell, that's down, and that there might be somewhere you could go that isn't that would be better, and that would be up, or at least towards up. And if you're at the bottom of the world and you're suffering miserably and you realize that you might have had something to do with it, and you make a decision that you're going to change, then you've also made a decision that down exists and so does up, and that you might strive to move towards what's up, even given your limited understanding of how to orient yourself properly in the world. And that's what Jacob swears to do. And so he builds an altar, which is a representation, you might say, of the connection between up, or heaven and earth. And he commits himself to this process of upward transformation, and he makes a sacrifice. And That's what you do when you decide to change, is you aim upward, whatever that means to you. At least you're going to try to stop doing the foolish things that got you in so much trouble you can't believe it. And you're going to what? Make a sacrifice? Or what does that mean? How about you give up doing all the stupid and unacceptable things that you did that brought you low to begin with? And that's a sacrificial gesture in the direction of what? In the direction of what? In the direction of up. Well, what does that mean? Well, Jacob has a dream, a famous dream that night. He dreams of Jacob's ladder, which is often represented as a spiral staircase to the stars, so to speak, and it wraps its way upward into the ineffable. There's no visualizing what's at the top. And you might ask, what does that mean? And it means just as hell is a bottomless pit, because there's no place you can get that's so awful that there isn't some damn stupid thing you can do to make it worse, so is heaven a spiral that moves itself upward without end, so that as you climb, the distance between you and the top remains constant, right? And that means that up is inexhaustible, and no matter how well you put the world together around you, there's still infinite opportunity upward left above you. And whatever's at the top of that, that's God. And that's a matter of definition, right? That's how that term, which is complex and incomprehensible, that's how that term is specified in the context of that story, right? God is what you aim at, however badly, when you decide to give up your idiocy and improve. Okay, now, let's see if we can specify that. So, in the story of Abraham, that spirit that abides on high is characterized in a particular manner. And so, in the story of Abraham, God comes to Abraham. God is what comes to Abraham as the spirit of adventure. Okay, now this is a very good thing to latch on to. So, when God comes to Noah, he comes to him as the intuition that warns the wise that all hell is going to break loose and that preparations need to be made. Okay, in the story of Abraham, God makes himself manifest as the spirit of adventure. Now, Abraham is an old man by the time this spirit descends upon him. He's in his 70s, and he's not really a very good person either. He's not kind of outright evil like Jacob and obsessed with power. He's more failure to launch type of pathology, right? Because he has rich parents and all of his needs are met, right? And so you might say he already lives in the socialist paradise. Everything that he could require in the manner that an infant might require is delivered to him without effort. And that seems to suffice for approximately 7 years. But you might ask yourself, is the state of infantile satiation the highest pinnacle of your development? And Abraham realizes, or God convinces him that that's not the case, and says to him that he has to leave his family and his tribe, the safety of his community and his security, and venture out into the world. And that's the same as moving towards the edge of psychological development, right? We don't learn in a state of satiation and security. We learn on the edge of challenge. And that's the edge that you play on, for example, when you're engaged in a sporting activity and you're pushing yourself to the limit of your ability in relationship to the people that you are competing and cooperating with in the context of the game. You want to be on the edge that transforms you, and that's the edge of adventure, and that's what God represents in the story of Abraham. And he invites Abraham to leave his zone of comfort and to dance on the edge of chaos and to transform himself beyond his wildest imaginings in consequence of that. And that's the Abrahamic covenant, which is the foundation of the biblical, of the Abrahamic societies. That's exactly it. At least the classic Abrahamic societies. They enter into the covenantal relationship that God offers to Abraham. That's a transformative endeavor. Now remember, Jacob is trying to transform upward, right? So this echoes that story. Okay, so what's the nature of the offer that God makes Abraham? Or what's the nature of the consequences of following the calling of the spirit of adventure that takes you beyond your zone of comfort out into the terrible world? And it is a terrible world. Like, the adventure that befalls Abraham is brutal, right? He encounters tyranny, and he encounters starvation, and he's sent to save the pathologized cities, and he's eventually called upon to sacrifice his own son. The adventure is tragic and brutal, and you might ask, well, why bother with that when the alternative might be to reside like a satiated infant in relative material comfort, especially when it's at hand? And God, who's the spirit of adventure, justifies that with the covenant, and what he says is this, and this is very much worth listening to. He says, if you leave your family, if you leave your comfort, and you venture out faithfully and with courage into the terrible world, voluntarily into the terrible world, in covenant with the highest, making the proper sacrifices along the way, which is what Abraham indicates he will do and does continually through the story, then you'll become a blessing to yourself. And that's a good deal, particularly if your life isn't a blessing to you, as so many lives seem not to be. Right? How do you have to conduct yourself so that you believe that your existence is a blessing? Well, maybe your existence is an adventure, and maybe it's a daring and difficult and ultimately challenging adventure, and not a search for infantile security or the pursuit of power or hedonic pleasure. And that's the offering that the spirit of adventure makes Abraham, and he accepts. And then God says, that's not all. And that's already pretty good, all things considered. He says, your name will become known among your people, and it will be known for valid reasons. And that's a pretty good deal too, because anybody who isn't an outright bloody psychopath actually matters. It actually matters to them how they're perceived by the people around them. And what you might hope for, if you had some sense and you were aiming upward in regard to what was best for you and for everyone else, was that you would conduct yourself in a manner that, so that people would admire what you're doing genuinely and regard you as a person that might be relied on in times of trouble, and who could serve as a source of accurate counsel when the storms come and the seas get rough. And is it the adventurous sort who turns into that sort of person? Well, that's the proclamation of the Abrahamic story. And so that's pretty good too, because people are certainly motivated, perhaps above all else, to attain a certain status, and that can be gained, and it is gained by the psychopathic and the power mad, but there's an element of it that's a beneficial ambition, because why wouldn't you want to conduct yourself, for example, so that your children and your wife admires you, and so that you're a beacon to the community? If you had the choice, and obviously you'd have to make the sacrifices necessary to do that, but the payoff would be, well, you'd be a blessing to yourself, and your name would become known validly to your community. So hooray! And you think, well, that's a pretty good deal and worth taking a risk for, and that's not all. Then God tells Abraham, if you do this forthrightly and wholeheartedly, and you bring your best to the table, which is what Abel does in the story of Cain and Abel, by the way, if you make the offerings that only you can make in the best possible way, and you go voluntarily on this adventure, you will establish something of lasting permanence that will echo down the generations. And that's why Abraham becomes the father of nations. And that's because the pattern of adventurous movement forward that he embodies is the best possible pattern for fatherhood. And if you manage that, to find a wife and to have children, but to establish in their psyches and in their behavior this pattern of faithful and courageous adventuring, then that success will cascade down the generations and multiply. And so that's a good deal. And then God says, that's not all. It's good already, but it's a big risk to do this. You'll do this in a way that will bring nothing but abundance to everyone else. Now that's a great offer, and very complex, because it's It doesn't offer a zero-sum version of the world. It's not a Malthusian world with limited resources. It's a proclamation that the spirit that guides you to maximally develop, which would be the spirit of adventure, is the same spirit that, when manifested in the world, unites people in the pursuit of peaceful abundance in a manner that brings far more to everyone without end. Right, and you see that echoed, for example, in the gospel stories. I mean, if you regard Christ in some sense as the ultimate adventurer, that's also why he's the perfect sacrifice. That's why he's the miraculous provider of the food that never ends. Right, and so then that's all pretty good, but it's not the end of it. The last offer is the capstone, so to speak, and he says, no one will be able to stand in your way. Right? Your friends will multiply and your enemies will flee before you. And that's not a military metaphor precisely. It's more the fact that if you adventure forward voluntarily, then you'll learn enough so that you're a master of your destiny, and that people will flock to you to cooperate with you, and your ventures will be successful because of the manner in which you conduct yourself, and you'll prove victorious in consequence of the ethics of your action. And so, and what's so interesting about this story, let's say, from a biological perspective, because you can certainly read it as an evolutionary biologist, it makes a very, I think, a claim that's undeniable, because the counterclaim is preposterous. The claim is that there's an instinct within you that you could characterize as a spirit that pulls you out into the world to develop and expand your apprehension and to shape your attention. And that proclivity to develop in the world is also what makes you optimally healthy psychologically. Well, the counter proposition would be that the spirit that motivates your child to be courageous and curious and to expand his field of competence is the same spirit that, if manifested, would make him miserable and sick. Well, no creature like that could exist. It has to be the case that the force that inspires you to become who you are has to be the same force that maximally adapts you to the world, because otherwise, what sort of misshapen monster would you be? At your best, you'd be the worst, and that's no one believes that. And it isn't only that; it's that instinct is allied with what other people will find respectable and admirable, and that will bring them together around you and help you organize your community in a manner that's integrated and peaceful and productive. And it has to be the case, because otherwise our instinct to develop would be at odds with our social being, and that's a completely idiotic theory, and no one would hold that. Why wouldn't you presume that if you were a voluntary adventurer and your children imitated you, that they would be much more likely to be successful? And isn't it the case that if everyone was doing that simultaneously, that society would become abundant, just as the American society that you all inhabit has become abundant, and for those reasons? And wouldn't it be the case that if you did that completely and made the appropriate sacrifices, then no one could stand in your way? And so I think this story is theologically impeccable. I think that it demolishes the claims of moral relativism. I think it's easily understandable in that context, and I think it's biologically solid, and that's a pretty good definition of truth as far as I can tell. And it's also salutary, and it provides some security if you understand it, and it's highly motivational. And so maybe that's why we remembered it for 3,000 years. And maybe that's why it's the foundation of the most sophisticated societies on earth, and a subset of which at least are also the most productive and peaceful societies on earth. And so that's the story of Abraham. And you know, Abraham is called upon, as he moves forward, the magnitude of his sacrifices increase. And you know that that's the case in your own life, is that's one of the consequences of success. Every time you reach a new pinnacle, let's say, you're called upon to be a little more than you were at the place of the last pinnacle. And that means at least to give up a little more of your immature foolishness, and also to aim a little more accurately and a little higher. And You see that in the story of Abraham because it's a series of it's a succession of sacrifices. And you can imagine that as he climbs upward up Jacob's ladder, his vision of what constitutes the ultimate refines, and so his aim improves as he moves forward, which is not much different than saying that you can in fact improve. And you see this in the Jacob story too, because as Jacob moves away from his pathological relationship with his mother and his power mad orientation, he disciplines himself and comes over time to be a good man, right? A man who can make peace with himself and his warring brother, for example. And so that's part of that process of upward spiraling improvement. And at the pinnacle, of course, Abraham is called upon to sacrifice the son that God has promised him forever. And he's willing to do that. You might ask, what does that mean, to be willing to sacrifice your child to what's highest? And that's absolutely in keeping with Abraham's pattern of action as an adventurer. Because if you are the sort of paternal figure, let's say, who encourages your child to move out into the world and to face their fears and to become ever more confident, you are sacrificing them to the terrible reality of their own life, in the belief that if they accept that challenge voluntarily and they themselves sacrifice to God, that they will become handlers of serpents and masters of terror and prevail in the world. And that's exactly what happens in the story of Abraham, because he voluntarily offers his son upwards and he gets him back. And that's exactly what happens to you in your life if you're blessed, let's say, and sensible, because you push your children out into the world and you tell them to pursue something other than you and your relationship and their security. And if that works out optimally, then they turn into adults and you get them back. Right? But in, what would you say, as equals and as people that you can be proud of, and as people who have lives that are blessings to themselves and who are admired by their own people and who establish something of permanence and who make the world a more abundant place and who prevail, and ethically so. And so, and of course, that sacrificial pattern, which is established with Abraham, is amplified in the book of Job, where it's portrayed as an answer to meaningless suffering, and then it finds its full expression in the Passion, which is at minimum, a archetypal representation of the pattern of total sacrifice upward that characterizes the proper foundation of abundant society, right? And we put that symbol of sacrifice, the crucifix, we put that symbol of voluntary sacrifice at the center of our churches, and the church at the center of our cities, because we understand, even though we don't know we understand this, or because we know when we don't understand, that the foundational principle that stabilizes the world and maybe the cosmos itself is the principle of upward striving, voluntary self-sacrifice, and that's optimized in the Passion story. And we know that enough so that we put that symbol at the center of our culture, even though our understanding of why that happens to be true is still less developed than it might be. And so that's an elaboration of that theme and a representation of what constitutes up, and an explanation of Jacob's ladder, and a representation of what constitutes sacrifice, and an indication of how narratives underlie our moral orientation and provide us with the ability to navigate in a world characterized by possibility and opportunity and suffering. Right. Thank you very much.
Questions? Any questions? Seems pretty straightforward to handle, right? So let me start off by asking you how you got on this pathway to writing a book, to doing research and storytelling, on kind of the biblical Old Testament story. And not only that, I mean, there's a whole lot more that you've done. But what started you on this pathway? Was there an inciting incident that said, you know what, I need to look more into the biblical narrative? Or was this something you grew up with? I mean, to unpack that for us, how did we get here?
Long-standing obsession with death and evil.
Okay.
Well, when I was...
there's psychologists who can help you with that.
Yeah, well, I found them. When I was 13, I read Solzhenitsyn's Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and started to investigate Soviet totalitarianism and at the same time delve into the horrors of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And I've always been obsessed with the idea of malevolence, more even than death, because malevolence and death are the two ultimate obstacles, you might say, to progress forward. And malevolence probably worse, more so than death. That's why, by the way, in the full passion, Christ is not only crucified in the most painful possible way, so that's the worst imaginable death. That's not enough. He has to harrow hell as well, and that means that the full confrontation with life, it's a terrifying thing to understand, is the voluntary willingness to confront both death and hell, right? The source of all malevolence. And you see the same thing in the story of Jonah, by the way, because Jonah runs from truth, and in consequence, and his conscience, and in consequence, he's condemned to death in the stormy seas. But then, despite the fact that he's dying, and you might think nothing is worse than that, and that you think that because you're naive, that's for sure. Then the beast from the abyss comes up and takes him in his jaws, and that's the same story. And like, I was very cognizant of the fact that these horrors, these political, economic horrors, were very, very real, and I was very curious about their source. And initially I did a political science degree, and I thought about going into law, and I thought about pursuing a political career, but I became convinced during my undergraduate years that the fundamental reasons for the existence of evil were neither political nor economic, despite the fact that all my professors insisted that they were, especially economic, because so many of them were leftists. And so I started to delve into clinical psychology because I understood, partly through Solzhenitsyn, I would say, that it was the proclivity for individual sin that was actually the causal factor, the primary causal factor in the establishment of totalitarian states. This is why, for example, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the angels come to Abraham and tell him that God is going to take out the pathologized cities. And Abraham objects. He says, you can't demolish a whole city because of the sins of its inhabitants, because there'll be innocent and good people intermixed with the miscreants and the hedonists and the power man strivers and the Machiavellians. And Abraham says, well, if I could find 50, I think he starts with 50 good people, will you spare the city? And God says yes. And Abraham, being a feisty sort of character, manages to bargain God down to 10. And there's a real reason for that, and the reason is that if there is a pathological city that's still free and open enough so that 10 people are daring enough to tell the truth, despite the fact that that will alienate them from their neighbors and cause them misery and grief, there's still hope for the city. And you're called upon to be one of those 10. And I started to understand that deeply when I was about 22. And I swore at that point that I would make whatever sacrifices were necessary to get to the bottom of that. And I meant the bottom. And so I've been doing that over decades, right? Trying to go deeper. That's what I'm doing with each lecture, is trying to go deeper and to find the fundamental principles. And
one of the things you talked about was this